rather than sort of start by overloading you with information, I'll ask at this point whether there are any questions on what I've covered so far, because I want you to feel free to ask questions. And don't worry if the question seems foolish or something that... Please.
Just to clarify what you just said, was that statement that one of the things a learned monk would know was the matika, was that in the suttas or was that later on?
No, that is mentioned in the suttas, yeah. Especially when sees this in the Anguttara Nikaya. I mentioned one source. It's the Book of Fours, Sutta number 160. Here the Buddha is speaking about those things that contribute to the long lifespan of the Dhamma. And one of those is that the junior monks will approach those monks who are learned, heirs to the heritage, experts on the Dhamma, experts on the Vinaya or discipline, and experts on the Matikas. For people who want to ask questions. Yeah, that makes it easier to get the questions.
Hello, I have a very quick question. Is this a generally accepted view that the connection between the Samyutta Nikaya and the Vibhanga, is that sort of what people... This connection, is this common in opinion?
I would say that this is pretty widespread amongst scholars who investigate the Abhidhamma. There is a book, it's by, I think he's an Austrian scholar, Frauwallner. I'll write his name. I think it's Erich Frauwallner. It's called Studies in the Abhidharma Literature and the Origins of the Buddhist Philosophical Systems, I think. It was published by SUNY, State University of New York. And A.K. Water has a book called Indian Buddhism, I believe. Well, he especially traces the origins of the Abhidhamma to the Matika, but I think he also mentions the Vibhanga Suttas. And then the Chinese scholar Venerable Yinshun, he also traces the origin of the Abhidhamma largely to the Vibhanga Suttas, as at least one source amongst others.
I just want to clarify, you had said scholars are not sure whether the Buddha actually passed down the Abhidhamma.
I didn't say that scholars are uncertain about that. There's a pretty general consensus among scholars that the Buddha didn't teach the Abhidhamma, the text of the Abhidhamma Pitaka as they've come down to us today.
Okay. So it's so extensive.
Yeah.
Who do scholars believe actually put that down in writing?
Okay, this comes to an important topic, which I think I'm going to touch on that. Let me see whether I have it for this morning or the afternoon. Yeah, I do have it actually for today's class. Okay, let us say that, let me give my conjecture, that probably the first development of the Abhidhamma would have started amongst the circle of the Buddha's disciples, perhaps the school or the group of disciples that were connected with Sariputta. But now when we speak about Abhidhamma, often Theravadins think the Abhidhamma is the Abhidhamma Pitaka in the Pali Canon, but there's actually 3 Abhidharma systems. One is the Abhidharma system of the Theravada, which is written in Pali, preserved in Pali, followed in the countries of southern Asia. There's another Abhidhamma system which developed in northern India, let's say it spread in Kashmir, it was widely studied in Kashmir and northern India. It was followed by a school which is now extinct called the Savastivada. That system also has a collection of 7 books, very different from the Theravada 7 books. And that system is preserved in Chinese translation, but is also studied by Tibetan monks and by learned Chinese and Japanese monks. The third Abhidhamma system consists of only one text an Abhidhamma treatise called the treatise spoken by, it's called the Sariputra Abhidhamma treatise. It seems to have belonged to a school that flourished perhaps in Gandhara, which now corresponds to Pakistan, Afghanistan. It's preserved only in Chinese translation, in a somewhat strange style of Chinese, a little difficult to understand. And that text seems to be affiliated in some ways with the Theravada Abhidhamma, because both the Theravada and the school in which the Sariputta Abhidhamma Shastra were preserved both seem to have common origins. Okay, so this indicates the fact that there are three Abhidharma systems which are quite different from each other, indicates or suggests that there could have been a very primitive, very elementary Abhidharma system which formed the nucleus of these three different systems which would have evolved and taken their own separate trajectories as the different monastic communities spread to different parts of India and settled there. So I would guess that it would have been groups in these monastic communities that worked out the details of each Abhidharma system.
Bhante, I had learned that those legendary 18 schools, that they each had their own Abhidhamma, and that's what was distinctive about them. But we only have 3 now that remain.
Yeah, whether all 18 schools had their own Abhidhamma, that I don't know. It's possible that several of the schools were following this. Yeah, maybe several schools were following basically the same Abhidhamma. Okay, we take in the back. Okay, you ask, and then you ask. And then after your question, then we'll have to move on. Please.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for this, Bhante, thank you for this overview and context to understand this. Yeah. And so in respect to the kind of overview and context, I'm trying to sort of place, is this all part of the Pali Canon that you mentioned? Is it the 3 baskets?
Yeah.
That the suttas, the Vinaya, and the Abhidhamma? And are all these parts that you're now talking about, the Matikas and the
commentaries and the summaries.
Right. Is that all part of the Pali Canon as well?
It's not part of the Pali Canon. You see, there's a distinction. The canon consists only of what we call canonical texts, but each of the canonical texts would have had a commentary written on it. The commentaries are written in Pali, but the commentaries probably built up over several centuries, and then they were edited and streamlined and put into their final form mostly by Buddhaghosa, sometimes by other commentators. And then a later generation, maybe 2 centuries later, 3 centuries later, other scholars would have written the tikas, the sub-commentaries. And then the summaries would have come still later. But what's called the Chatta Sanghayana, the 6th Council Tripitaka that one finds online, put out by Sri Goenka's group in India, that includes both the canonical texts, the commentaries, and sub-commentaries. So one gets all that material in Pali in that collection. But only the actual Pitakas are regarded as canonical texts.
She asked, what does Vitaka mean?
Pitaka, literally it means a basket, but more generally we could say it, or less literally, it means a collection. So Sutta Pitaka is the collection or compilation of the suttas, the discourses. Vinaya Pitaka, the compilation of the monastic regulations. Abhidhamma Pitaka, the compilation of the Abhidharma treatises. Okay, we'll take this question here.
You mentioned the 4/5 Nikāyas.
Yeah.
And the 5th one always gets tagged on. That's the Khuddaka?
Yeah.
We were talking about in our local group this subject recently, and I wondered if you could give us some characterization of that 5th one.
Okay.
And also a little bit, if possible, if it's not too long a discussion, of the chronology.
Okay, very good question. Okay, you see the word Khuddaka originally meant little. But of the 5 Nikāyas, it turned out to be the biggest because it contains an assortment of, we call miscellaneous texts. Some of these texts stem from a very early period, so we could regard most of them as belonging to roughly the same period as the 4 main Nikāyas. Those texts would be Dhammapada, Sutta Nipata, Therigatta, Udana, Itivutaka. No, Abhidhamma, I would say, is somewhat later. But some of these texts, like even Dhammapada, might contain verses that come from a later period. Therigatta, there might be verses that come from a somewhat later period. But within them, the bulk, we say, stems from a very early period. Okay, then we have texts which seem to have accrued a bit later, maybe several centuries later. One would be the Abhidhamma, which are stories in verse about the backgrounds and past lives of the monks who became the great disciples, the nuns who became great disciples of the Buddha. Jataka, which are the verses which relate the past life events of the Buddha when he was existing in various past lives. Abhidhamma, Jataka. What's some of the others? The two very important. Charya Pitaka. That's again, it's like a selection of Jataka type stories. Then Buddha Vangsa is the story about how the person who is to become the Buddha Gautama formed his first vow to become a Buddha, and then what he did during the careers of the other Buddhas. So I've heard that the ABC in popular Buddhism in Southeast Asia, it's not Dhammapada, Majjhima Nikāya, Samyutta Nikāya, but the A is the Abhidhamma, B is Buddha Vangsa, and C is the Charya Pitaka. And then there are some texts which are have almost like a commentarial nature, but it's from a very early period. These include one work, a philosophical work called Patisambhida Magga, the Book of Analysis, and another is called the Nidesa. The Nidesa is analysis of certain sections of the Sutta Nipata. So those texts are regarded as having arisen, it could be 2 or 3 centuries after the time of the Buddha. Okay, now I think I want to return back to the subject of the presentation. Okay, so now the heading is to try to find what I call continuity and objectives or aims between the Nikāyas and the Abhidhamma. And now if you remember the Buddha's first discourse on the 4 Noble Truths, the Buddha, after explaining each of the Noble Truths, he goes on to make a statement about each of the Noble Truths. Do you remember? The first Noble Truth, what is to be done with the first Noble Truth? Exactly, to be fully understood. Pariññeyang. Dukkhaṃ sacchaṃ pariññeyang. The truth of suffering is to be fully understood. The truth of the origin of suffering. What is the function or task regarding that truth? I heard it coming from this direction. Now it's coming from several directions. To be abandoned. So we have to eliminate the truth. The origin of suffering is craving, so that has to be abandoned or eliminated. The third Noble Truth, what is to be done with that? To be realized, to be experienced, known, to be experienced, to be realized. And the fourth Noble Truth is the path, so what is to be done with the path? To be developed, to be cultivated. Now, we could see from the concerns of the early Abhidhamma that they are, the founders of the Abhidhamma are, the way I say it, they're constructing the Abhidhamma according to the pattern of the tasks set for the 4 Noble Truths. particularly first, second, and fourth. Since the third truth, which is Nibbana, is to be realized, one doesn't really have to say very much about that. It always enters into the Abhidhamma system mainly through negation of the characteristics of the other noble truths. So, I have to jump ahead a little bit here. Okay, so the truth of suffering, so when the Buddha is explaining the quintessence of the truth of suffering, as we saw later, he explains this to mean the five aggregates which are subject to clinging. Those are the objects of clinging. And so to break that clinging to the five aggregates, one has to understand them. And understanding the five aggregates, the way it's expressed in the sutta, means that one understands the nature of each aggregate, what it is. One understands its arising, how it arises, and how it passes away. And this is also stated with regard to the 6 internal and external sense bases, to understand what they are, how they arise, how they pass away. And so the Abhidhamma, what it is undertaking, is a very detailed and exhaustive examination of the five aggregates, looking at them from many different angles. Some would say from too many angles, but probably at an early period, the examination of the five aggregates was simpler and more concise. But as time went on, complexity set in and the system came to be developed and elaborated from different perspectives. Okay, then the origin of suffering is, we would say, what is the origin of suffering? Craving, and even deeper than craving, it's ignorance. So we could say ignorance and craving are the root causes of suffering, and the task for this second noble truth is to abandon ignorance and craving. And to abandon ignorance and craving, one has to know all of the factors that arise in association with ignorance and craving. And those factors come to be grouped together. They come to be incorporated into different sets of groups which fall under the general designation of defilements. So we call them kilesa. So we have different groups of defilements. We have 4, word very difficult to translate, asavas. Venerable Nyanamoli had used taints, which I kept in the translations that I did. I don't really like it so much. But I would maybe use now influxes, things that flow in. We have other defilements are called floods, bonds, hindrances, latent tendencies, fetters, and so on. Many lists of these sets of defilements. And these are just mentioned in the suttas. But what one finds in the Abhidhamma is these sets are broken down into their the factors are already mentioned in the suttas, but each of the factors is given a formal definition, and so you get to know in quite detail what each of these factors is. And then in order to eliminate the defilements, to eliminate the cause or origin of suffering, one has to develop basically the Noble Eightfold Path. But the suttas mention various other factors that are also, almost equivalent with the Noble Eightfold Path, other factors that have to be developed. So what are some of these other factors to be developed? That's being too specific now. We want to get the broadest category. 37 bodhipakkhiyas. And so that's, the 4 foundations of mindfulness, 4 right efforts, for memory is getting bad. Yeah. The basis for spiritual power, iddhipadas, 5 what? Right. You say the 5 faculties, then the 5 what? Powers, 7 enlightenment factors, then 8 path factors. So we have 37. So what we find again in the Abhidhamma is often the detailed analysis is made of these 37 Bodhipakkhya Dhammas. Again, they're treated both from the standpoint of the suttas, using sutta formulas, but sometimes treating them in more detail, and then using the distinctive analytical system of the Abhidhamma to explain them. Okay, so in this way we could say at an early period, finer, more detailed explanations were given of the factors to be fully understood, 5 aggregates, 12 sense bases, 18 elements, more detailed explanations of the different classes of defilements, formal definitions are given, the factors of the path are analyzed in greater detail. And so this, we could say, the kind of work that was going on during this period would be, I would conjecture, the missing link between the Sutta Pitaka and the Abhidhamma Pitaka. This is in a way, it's something of a mystery to Buddhist scholarship, that we have the Nikāyas, which are regarded as the oldest strata of texts, the Abhidhamma Pitaka, which generally it's dated maybe the earliest, the 3rd century. So what was going on in this period between the Nikāyas and the Abhidhamma? Of course, monks were meditating and achieving realization, but there were other monks who were disposed to a more analytical investigation of the teaching, who wanted to understand its implications, who were expounding it to others, and so they wanted to explain it in greater depth and detail. And so in this way, I would assume that a continual expansion and elaboration was taking place until at some point the systems that were emerging were compressed into the form of treatises or books, and that became the Abhidhamma Pitaka. Okay, so now I'm dealing with the section of my outline called the emergence of the Abhidhamma. Okay, so it would seem that as these topics taken from the Sutta Pitaka were being explored in greater detail, elaborated upon, the need arose, or a need was felt for a kind of broader theoretical model which could encompass all of the elements of experience, all the defilements of the mind, all the factors to be developed for enlightenment, to bring these together into one very broad framework. And the problem that one finds in the Nikāyas is that often there's no explicit correlation between the sets or the schemes that are set up for classifying the factors of experience. For example, in the suttas, we have 5 aggregates, and then there are 12 sense bases, which are said to include the all. You know the sutta on the all? I will teach you amongst the all. What is the all? The eye and forms, ear and sounds, etc., etc. Mind and mental phenomena. So, in some sense, everything that's in the 5 aggregates should be in the 12 sense bases. Or is it? That I don't know. Then there are the 18 elements, which include 6 senses, 6 objects, 6 types of consciousness. So how do these all relate to one another. The sutta doesn't make that explicit. So we could conjecture. Sometimes we find people who just follow the suttas come to different opinions about it, and sometimes they divide quite bitterly over their different opinions. But when we come to the Abhidhamma, well, one also finds different opinions. But the Abhidhamma, at least one of the works of the Abhidhamma, attempts to bring all of these together into one all-embracing scheme that relates what of the form aggregate, which sense bases belong to the form aggregate, which elements belong to the form aggregate, where do the aggregates, feeling, perception, volitional activities, where do they belong amongst the sense bases, amongst the elements? So we could see that, these later generations of monks were exploring these issues. And when I say monks, probably nuns were also exploring, but let the word monks serve. Because there's a poem in the Therigatha, right, where a junior nun says that I approached the elder nun so-and-so, and she taught me the aggregates, the sense bases, and the elements. She approached Patachara, right. Okay, then what happens in the Abhidhamma is that certain categories found in the suttas come to be expanded. Particularly, this is the Sankhara Kanda, the fourth aggregate, which is the one which usually puzzles people the most. Physical form, one could understand. It's matter. Feeling, perception, relatively clear. Consciousness, still question arises, the relation between consciousness and perception. But the sankharas, what are the sankharas? Now, in the suttas, the aggregate of the sankharas is explained very simply as the 6 types of volition. Volition regarding